we're going to start our conversation around the triple evil of racism with our first guest, who is a renowned author, anti-racist author and educator, Mr. Tim Wise. We want to bring Mr. Wise on, Tim on, and start our conversation with him around this topic. Welcome. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
Oh,
Thank
you
you for
bet.
being here. And thank you for all that you've written. I'm not so sure. It's all out there, even in following you on social media. And I'm looking at what you read and gaining more understanding. And the book that has stuck with me the most, that I think a lot of our solutions are in, Tim, is Between Barack and a Hard Place. So I want to spend some time exploring that, but I just want to start with your thoughts on where we are right now as a nation, just an overview of where
Sure.
you think we are, and the number one responsibility in particular that white people have in helping us to end racism.
Sure. Well, in one sense, we're exactly where we've always been. And in another sense, we're in a uniquely dangerous place. So let me briefly sort of explain what I mean. In the one sense, we are still grappling with the same thing we have grappled with, usually unsuccessfully, for 400 years. That is the legacy of white supremacy, which has been systematically ingrained in the country since the colonial era, since before it was a country, a constant battle trying to define who is this place for. That has been the story of the United States. Who is it for? And of course, the founders of the country made it very clear who it was for, because the very first law that Congress passed after the Constitution was ratified was the Naturalization Act of 1790, which said it was just for white people. And essentially, you couldn't be a citizen if you weren't a white person. So the first thing they did before anything, before they raised an army in case the Brits decided to come back and have another run at it, before they figured out the taxes, they wanted to make clear that this was a nation for white people. That has been embedded in the soil from the beginning. Now, if I'm a public school teacher in at least 15 states in this country right now, and I say that, I'll be fired, not because it's not true, but because it apparently is too inconvenient to acknowledge. So in the one sense, we're in the same place we've been. In another sense, though, very important, we're at a uniquely dangerous moment. And what happened in Buffalo last week is an indication of this. There have always been a subset of people who have feared, the sort of replacement of their group by others. So this notion of the so-called great replacement, oh, those people are going to come and take our stuff, that's been around a long time. Ben Franklin actually said it about the Germans, that they were going to take the place of the Anglo-Americans. So we've been moving the target for a long time. But the reason it's so uniquely dangerous now is really two things. Number one, that argument has been imbued with this conspiratorial mentality. So it's not just newcomers are coming and we don't quite trust them or like them. It's that there's a group of people deliberately bringing people in to steal your country, to hurt you, because they hate you. So once you say that, right, once you have this existential crisis and a conspiratorial mindset, you're almost guaranteed to have mass violence, because at that point we can't have rational debates anymore. We can't have a discussion about immigration if you think there's a plot to destroy you. At that point, it's kill or be killed. So that's new. And what's also new is that white Americans really are on the precipice of no longer being an absolute majority. So if you were worried about replacement like 50 or 100 years ago, you were sort of like, that's a little weird. But now the truth is white folks really are going to be less than 50%. And the problem is that when you are a group of people that have been used to hegemony, pluralism feels like oppression to you, right? If you have 100% of the toys in the sandbox on the playground, and suddenly you got to share the toys, and nobody ever taught you how to share, it makes you uniquely dangerous. So we're dealing with some of the same stuff, but there's a uniquely problematic moment that we're in that we have to understand, because it's not just the same thing for 400 years. It's all of that and this particular moment when the dominant group feels like, the wheels are coming off the bus, because they're actually having to either embrace multicultural democracy or feel as though they've lost everything. That makes that group of people, that subset of white Americans, very dangerous.
Tim, this is a very important conversation for the King Center to have, because often when people mention Dr. King, they disassociate him from speaking truth about white supremacy, colonialism, imperialism, racism. There's been a real whitewashing, if we put it
Oh,
that
sure.
way, of Dr. King and his teachings. But he actually talks about the responsibility of white people to eradicate white supremacy. And I'll share more of
Absolutely.
that quote later in this beloved community talks experience. But
Absolutely.
how important are you finding it to connect white people in a way that they can understand that, as the
Right.
third principle of nonviolence says, the effort is not to defeat white people, but to defeat racism and to defeat white supremacy? How do you educate people
Right.
from that perspective?
Well, it's obviously critically important. The problem that we're up against is that we have never really looked at this issue in its proper systemic way. So when we think
Right.
of racism, right, we think of it as an individualistic thing. Our analysis defaults to an individual analysis. So it's, you're a racist, you're a bad person, you need to be fixed, you have implicit bias, you
Hmm.
have whatever. And that's not to say implicit bias isn't real. It's not to say that racism at the individual level isn't real. Of course it is. But the systems and structures are the source even of those individual biases. Where do we learn our biases? We don't just learn them from overtly hateful parents. We learn them from a culture that has kept inequality in place and then encourages us to judge the people on the bottom, to elevate the people at the top, and to give them far more credit than they deserve for being there. So in a sense, racism is embedded individually by the system. If you understand that, you can bring white people in because they don't feel blamed and shamed. You know,
Mm-hmm.
it's not about saying you're bad people. It's about saying, listen, really good people can get caught up in broken systems. And when good people get caught up in broken systems, they are far more likely to be broken by that system than they are to repair that system, because they don't even realize the forces that are affecting them. So I think it's possible to bring white folks in, but the first and foremost thing is to challenge that hyper individualistic default position and think in systemic terms.
Think in systemic terms. I just want to share some things that we want you to tweet out, because what Tim just said is very key. Racism is personal, of course, but it's also systemic. We absolutely want to invite people in, white people in, and say, not only is this something that's not about just being an ally, but it's something that if we don't eradicate racism, it will destroy all of humanity. Dr. King talked about that, how this may well be what takes human beings out of here,
Right.
because it's so connected to militarism and so connected to poverty. You have in this book 5 things white people can do. 5 things white people can do to help eradicate racism and white supremacy. This is in Tim's book, Between Barack and a Hard Place, which is revelatory and connects back to something I've thought about for years, that when President Obama was elected, people had these shirts on that said, "The dream realized."
Mm-hmm.
And it would connect him back to Dr. King, as though Dr. King's dream was fully realized in the election of a Black president.
Right.
You talk about in your book how dangerous that thinking was, and how it caused people to believe that racism was over because we had a Black president, and how Black success causes some people to believe that racism is over. Can you talk about that for a moment? How
Well,
dangerous is that thinking?
Well, it's funny. I wrote that book so long ago now. I don't honestly remember off the top of my head what the 5 things are. I'm sure they were quite good though, so I do
I have
recommend.
them right here. I'm
But
gonna.
but I will say this. Let me say this. I can extend the analysis from that period to now, because not only do people default to the individual analysis that says, Barack Obama's election was going to solve the problem, but then they also get in the mode of thinking that once you get rid of Donald Trump, that the problem will be solved. And the
Correct.
reality is, long before Donald Trump became president, long before those boys in Charlottesville marched in 2017, and ultimately one of them ran his car into a group and killed Heather Heyer, long before any of those white nationalists were even born, all of these systems of inequality and injustice were in place. And so presidents come and presidents go, congressional leaders come, congressional leaders go, and these systems remain. Inequities in housing, in healthcare, in wealth. Donald Trump didn't create the wealth gap, whereby the typical white household right now, right in the midpoint, the median, that doesn't even have a high school diploma has 1/3 more wealth on average than the typical black household headed by a college graduate. Donald Trump didn't do that, and Barack Obama didn't solve that, because that is a systemic problem that is generations in the making. Understanding racism as Newton's first law of motion is what I would recommend. And that is to say, Newton's first law of motion is inertia, right? The idea that an object in motion tends to remain in motion. The same is true not only in the physical universe, but in the historical and economic and social universe. That which happens in one generation is going to continue to affect the next and the next and the next until it is met by a force of equal or greater weight to push against it and arrest its trajectory. We have to think in those terms. And just very briefly, let me say, we're seeing the cost of not doing that right now. We have lost 1 million lives to COVID. And let me suggest to those watching that the reason that happened cannot simply be laid at the feet of one particular administration. The reason it happened, in my belief, as far as I'm concerned, is that 2 or 3 months in, back in 2020, in March and April, when only 28% of the dead were white, there were a lot of white folks in this country who looked around and they saw mass death in New York, and they saw mass death in New Orleans, and they saw mass death in black and brown urban communities. And they decided, this ain't about us. Right? This is not my problem. It's not going to come to me. And then by December of 2020, after they took their foot off the brake, didn't want to put on a mask, didn't want to stand 6 feet away from anybody because they needed to go to the hair salon. They needed to go to Buffalo Wild Wings. They needed to go and get their party on and go to the game. 6 or 8 months later, 55% of the dead were white. Now it's 63% of those who have died, meaning that we have families in this country, white families, who have buried their parents and have buried their grandparents and have buried their children and friends and other loved ones because they didn't care enough about Black life. This is why we say until Black lives matter, no lives matter. No lives because when you don't take care of business over there, it will come back to you. We have to understand that. And that, by the way, is an insight, not mine. That is an insight of Derek Bell and critical race theory, this thing that is being attacked right now falsely in this country. The idea that there is interest convergence that we have to see between the interest of Black and brown peoples and the interest of the larger country. And if we can get our head around that, then perhaps we can pull out of this problem, but not until then.
We can pull out of this problem. That's when we start exploring the history. As you mentioned, CRT, I thought about immediately this third thing that you say. You say white people must be willing to hear and grapple with the history of this nation. And one of the things that's happening now is an attempt to erase, not have our children learn, not talk about not only the past devastation of racism, but the current devastation of racism. So how can we get in a place where when we're talking to each other, when we engage in white people, we explore this history in ways that allow people to understand if we don't tackle racism, it'll be devastating, not only for this entire nation, but for the world, for our global community?
I think number one is by continuing to keep the focus on systems. One of the reasons that people are in full-scale backlash against honest historical discussion is because they still think it's about making white children feel guilty. Right? But you know, my argument is if you're feeling guilty about white people, then you're learning about the wrong white people, right? Like it means you're learning about Jefferson and Andrew Jackson. You're learning about people who were enslavers and who were involved in indigenous removal. You're not learning about white allies in history. You're not learning about Anne Braden. You're not learning about Bob and Dottie Zellner. You're not learning about Virginia Foster Durr. You're not learning about Reverend John Fee, who was disaffiliated from the Presbyterian Synod during the period of enslavement because he would not minister to people that owned other human beings as property. There's a history, not long enough, but there is a history of white folks who stood against white supremacy. And if we would teach that to young people, two things would happen. Number one, nobody would have to feel guilty because white folks could have some different role models. And number two, we could perhaps prevent the radicalization of the Peyton Gendrons, or however you pronounce this guy's name in Buffalo. You could prevent radicalization by providing young white people with a different identity of how to live in this skin, a different way to be white in this society than what they have been given. So that's part of the history too. It isn't enough to learn about Black and brown leadership, though we must learn about that. We must also realize that there have been white folks that took a different road that we can also follow. So we have to be engaged in that process. And I think if we do that, and we shouldn't be waiting for the schools to teach this material. You know, we definitely need to push back on the attack on schools doing this work, but also I don't want to trust my children's education on these things just to the schools. We also need to be talking about this in our homes. We need to be talking about this in our places of worship.
Yes.
We need to be talking about this in our nonprofit spaces and giving accurate information to young people, whether or not the schools are doing it, though we hope they will.
Listen, if you're viewing this right now, I want you to share this broadcast and invite people, in particular, invite some white folks and say, you need to watch what Tim Wise just shared on this Beloved Community Talks broadcast. We want to get as many people as possible who hear this so that we can continue these courageous conversations. And then we invite you to have these conversations at home. One last thing, you share a quote directly from Dr. King's book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? Change does not roll in on the wheels of inevitability, but comes through continuous struggle. What's the white person's struggle right now as we continue to grapple with racism and as we mourn? Particularly devastating to me was that we are mourning the loss of 9 people over the age of 50, some of them over the age of 70, old enough to be my grandmothers and my grandfather, who have lived their lives in this country grappling with racism for over 70 years, to have their lives snuffed out by an 18-year-old white male with the N-word on the end of this assault rifle. Just how unjust that is. And as we look at that and examine that and mourn that, what continues to be the struggle that white people are going through concerning racism?
Well, I think the struggle we need to be going through is asking ourselves one very simple question, and that is, do we love ourselves enough to do right by this country? And what I mean by that is when white folks allow or collaborate with, by our silence, white supremacy, we not only devastate the lives of quote unquote non-white peoples, of people of color, we cheapen our own. What we say is that we're placing a greater value on the color of our skin than we are our humanity. And when we do that, we sacrifice the future of our children. We sacrifice the future of our grandchildren. We are not doing ourselves any favors by clinging to chimeras. We are not doing ourselves any favors by clinging to this mythology, this lie of whiteness. This lie of whiteness that's burdened us for 400 years is why we still don't have universal health care. It's why we have this gun violence, because remember, the primary reason the Second Amendment is in place as it is because there were folks that wanted to make sure that white militias would have enough guns to keep Black folks from revolting against the system of enslavement. You see, we have the amendment to allow white men to have guns to keep Black people at bay, and then we get tens of thousands of white people that die from those same weapons every year. So do we love ourselves as human beings? Do we love our country as a multicultural democracy, or do we love this? That's the question, because what I'm seeing is that we love our guns more than we love our children. We love our skin color more than we love our country. And we love all of that more than we love our own humanity, to say nothing of Black humanity and brown humanity, even our own. We cheapen ourselves by clinging to white supremacy. We deserve better. We can do better. We can be better. That's what I think we need to be struggling with right now.
We deserve better. We can do better. We can be better. Put that out in the atmosphere tonight. Thank you so much, Tim. Yeah. Thank you so much. I want to mention your latest book, Dispatches from the Race War, and encourage everyone to read what Tim Wise has written. That's so educational, so profound, such an asset, I believe, to our thinking and then also our work to eradicate racism and white supremacy. Thank you for being with us. Thank you.
Thank you.